The early morning sun peeked through the tall windows of Judge Sarah Thompson's chambers, casting long shadows across her polished wooden desk. At 42 years old, Sarah had spent the last 12 years building a reputation as one of the city's most respected judges. Her dark hair was neatly pulled back in a professional bun, and her wire-rimmed glasses sat perfectly straight on her nose as she reviewed the day's cases. The clock on her wall showed 8:15 a.m. Sarah had arrived early, as she always did, to prepare for her busy schedule. Her small office was organized and tidy, with law books carefully arranged on the shelves and case files stacked neatly on her desk. Family photos decorated one corner, showing happy moments with her parents who had always supported her dream of becoming a judge. As she sipped her morning coffee from her favorite blue mug, her clerk, Michael, knocked on the door. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said, entering with another stack of files. "Today's calendar is quite full. We have the Henderson case at 9:30, followed by 3 arraignments." Sarah nodded, her dark eyes scanning the new documents. She had earned this position through hard work, graduating at the top of her class from law school and spending years as a public defender before becoming a judge. Her colleagues respected her for her fair decisions and deep understanding of the law. "The Henderson case might be challenging," she said to Michael, adjusting her reading glasses. "The evidence is complicated, and both lawyers are known for their long arguments." She smiled slightly, remembering her own days as a lawyer in the same courtroom she now presided over. Looking out her window, Sarah could see the courthouse steps already filling with people. The building itself was an old structure, built in the 1930s, with tall columns and wide marble steps. It represented everything she believed in: justice, equality, and the rule of law. She stood up and walked to the small bathroom connected to her chambers. Her black judge's robe hung on a hook behind the door, pressed and ready for another day of court. As she put it on, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The robe had always meant something special to her. It was a symbol of responsibility and trust. Sarah checked her watch again and realized she had a lunch meeting scheduled with other judges from the district. They were planning to discuss new programs to help young offenders, something she was particularly passionate about. She decided she would drive today instead of walking, as time might be tight between morning sessions. Returning to her desk, she began reviewing the Henderson case files one last time. The details were complex, a property dispute between neighbors that had turned ugly. These were the kinds of cases that required patience and careful attention to detail, qualities Sarah was known for. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother, wishing her a good day. Sarah smiled, remembering how proud her parents had been at her swearing-in ceremony. Being one of the few black female judges in the district had never been easy, but her family's support had always kept her going. "Your Honor," Michael appeared at the door again. "The courtroom is ready, and the first parties are arriving." Sarah gathered her notes and took a final sip of coffee. She straightened her robe and picked up her gavel, a gift from her father when she became a judge. The wooden handle was smooth from years of use, and it felt comfortable in her hand. Just before leaving her chambers, she paused at her favorite photo, one of her standing with her mentor, the first black female judge in their city's history. That woman had opened doors for others to follow, and Sarah worked every day to do the same for the next generation. "Time to begin," she said to herself, walking toward her courtroom. The familiar sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor echoed through the hallway. As she approached the courtroom doors, she could hear the quiet murmur of voices inside. Another day of serving justice was about to begin, though she had no way of knowing this particular day would be unlike any other in her career. The bailiff saw her approaching and stood straighter. In a few moments, he would announce her arrival with the traditional "all rise," and another day in courtroom 307 would officially begin. Sarah took a deep breath, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring, unaware that her biggest test wouldn't come from inside her courtroom, but from an encounter that would shake the entire justice system. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as Judge Sarah Thompson left the courthouse parking lot in her black Toyota Camry. Her morning sessions had run longer than expected, and she was now running late for her lunch meeting. The digital clock on her dashboard showed 1:15 p.m., and she had to be at the restaurant by 1:30. Sarah drove carefully through the city streets, maintaining the speed limit and following all traffic rules. Her car was neat and organized, just like her chambers, with a few law books on the back seat and a small American flag hanging from her rearview mirror. She had owned this car for 5 years, and it was as reliable as she was. As she approached the intersection of Maple and 4th Street, Sarah came to a complete stop at the stop sign. She checked both ways, just as she always did, before proceeding. In her rearview mirror, she noticed a police cruiser that had been following her for the last few blocks. She didn't think much of it until she saw the flashing lights turn on. Her heart rate increased slightly as she pulled over to the right side of the road, positioning her car perfectly parallel to the curb. Sarah had been driving for 25 years and had never received a ticket. She turned off her engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and waited calmly. Through her side mirror, she watched as Officer James Barrett stepped out of his patrol car. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, wearing the blue uniform of the city police department. His walk seemed more aggressive than necessary as he approached her window, one hand resting on his gun holster. "License and registration," Officer Barrett demanded, without the usual police greeting. His tone was harsh, and he shined his flashlight directly into her face, despite it being bright daylight. "Good afternoon, officer," Sarah replied politely, keeping her hands visible. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" "You ran that stop sign back there," Officer Barrett said sharply. "I need to see your license and registration now." Sarah knew she hadn't run the stop sign. She had stopped completely, just as she always did. "Officer, I'm certain I made a complete stop," she said calmly. "I always do, especially at that intersection." Officer Barrett's face hardened. "Are you arguing with me?" he asked, his voice rising. "Because I clearly saw you roll through that stop sign." Staying professional, Sarah reached slowly for her purse. "I'm going to get my license now," she announced clearly, remembering the proper protocol she had discussed many times in her courtroom. As she opened her wallet, she decided to also show her bar card and judicial identification. "I want you to know that I'm Judge Sarah Thompson from the municipal court," she said, holding out her credentials. "I'm actually running late for a lunch meeting with—" "Sure you are," Officer Barrett interrupted with a scoff. "And I'm the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court." His sarcasm was thick and dismissive. Sarah remained calm, though she could feel her pulse quickening. "Officer Barrett," she said, reading his name tag, "I can assure you that these credentials are real. You can easily verify this by calling the courthouse." The officer snatched her documents, studying them with obvious skepticism. His facial expression shifted between doubt and anger. "These look fake," he declared. "Where did you get these?" "They're not fake, Officer Barrett," Sarah replied firmly. "I've been a judge in this city for 12 years. You can call." "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Barrett suddenly commanded, his hand moving to his gun holster again. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but kept her voice steady. "Officer, I would like to speak with your supervisor." "I said, step out of the vehicle." Officer Barrett's voice had risen to a shout. "Do it now, or I'll have to remove you myself." Several passers-by had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Sarah could see people taking out their phones, some starting to record. She thought about all the similar situations she had heard about in her courtroom, never imagining she would find herself in one. "I'm going to comply," she said clearly, wanting her words to be heard by the witnesses. "But I want to state that I'm doing so under protest, and I am formally requesting to speak with your supervisor." As she carefully unbuckled her seatbelt, Sarah's mind raced through all the legal implications of what was happening. She had presided over hundreds of cases involving police encounters, but now she was about to experience firsthand what so many had described from her witness stand. The day that had started so normally in her chambers was about to take a turn that would shake the entire city's justice system. Judge Sarah Thompson stepped out of her car carefully, her hands visible and movement slow. The hot afternoon sun beat down on the growing scene, and more people had gathered on the sidewalk, their phones recording everything. Officer Barrett stood aggressively close, his hand still resting on his gun. "Walk to the back of your vehicle and place your hands on the trunk," Officer Barrett commanded, his voice filled with unnecessary authority. Sarah noticed his body camera was on, its small red light blinking steadily. Sarah followed his instructions precisely, her black heels clicking against the pavement. Her judicial robe was still in the back seat of her car, and she wished she had worn it to lunch. Maybe then, Officer Barrett would believe who she really was. "Officer, I want to state again that I am Judge Sarah Thompson, she said clearly, making sure her voice would be picked up by his body camera. You're making a serious mistake. Stop telling lies, Officer Barrett snapped, moving closer. Impersonating a judge is a serious crime, and so is having fake government ID. His face was red with anger now, and a vein pulsed in his forehead. A young woman on the sidewalk stepped forward. I know her, the woman called out. She really is a judge. I just saw her in court last week. Step back, Officer Barrett yelled at the woman. This is police business. Everyone needs to stay back. More people had gathered now. Sarah could hear their whispers and see more phones recording. Some people were shaking their heads in disbelief. A few were making phone calls, and Sarah hoped someone was contacting the courthouse. Officer Barrett. Sarah tried again, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. Please call the courthouse. Ask for Chief Judge Williams. He can confirm my identity immediately. She knew her colleague would be having lunch in his chambers, as he did every Thursday. Instead of listening, Officer Barrett roughly grabbed her wrist. You have the right to remain silent. He began reading her rights, while pulling her arms behind her back. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, and Sarah felt a wave of emotions she had never experienced before. As a judge, she had watched hundreds of arrests from her bench, but being handcuffed herself was completely different. The metal bit into her skin, and she realized Officer Barrett had made them too tight on purpose. The handcuffs are too tight, she said firmly. You're cutting off my circulation. Criminals always complain about the cuffs, Officer Barrett replied with a smirk. Maybe you should have thought about that before trying to pretend you're a judge. A businessman in a suit had stopped at the scene. This is outrageous, he shouted. I've appeared in her courtroom. She's telling the truth. More voices joined in from the crowd. That's Judge Thompson. Someone call the police chief. This isn't right. Officer Barrett's face grew even redder as he heard the crowd's comments. He grabbed Sarah's arm roughly and started walking her toward his police car. Sarah could feel her heart pounding, but she kept her composure, knowing that everything was being recorded. I am going to cooperate fully, she announced loudly and clearly, but I want everyone to witness that I have identified myself as Judge Sarah Thompson. I have shown proper credentials, and I have requested a supervisor multiple times. The crowd had grown to about 30 people now. Some were following as Officer Barrett walked her to his car. Sarah could hear people making phone calls, and she caught fragments of their conversations. At 4th and Maple, arresting Judge Thompson. You need to send someone now. As Officer Barrett opened the back door of his patrol car, Sarah saw another police car turning the corner with its lights on. She silently prayed it was a supervisor, but Officer Barrett quickly pushed her into the back seat before the other car could arrive. Sitting in the back of the police car, Sarah felt the rough plastic of the seat against her legs. The handcuffs dug into her back, and she could barely move. Through the window, she saw the second police car pull up, and a sergeant stepped out, looking confused at the scene. The crowd immediately surrounded the sergeant, many people talking at once, pointing at Sarah in the car and at Officer Barrett. Sarah watched through the window as the sergeant's expression changed from confusion to shock. She knew that soon, Officer Barrett would learn exactly how big a mistake he had made, but for now, she sat quietly, her mind already thinking about the changes this incident would bring to her city's police department. Sergeant Mike Reynolds rushed toward the police car where Judge Sarah Thompson sat handcuffed in the back seat. His face showed clear alarm as he recognized her through the window. Officer Barrett stood nearby, still looking proud of his arrest, completely unaware of the storm he had created. Barrett. Sergeant Reynolds called out sharply. Open that car door right now. His voice carried the weight of authority that made several bystanders step back. Officer Barrett's smug expression began to fade as he noticed his sergeant's serious tone. Sir, this woman was using fake credentials, claiming to be a judge. Open the door now. Sergeant Reynolds' face had turned red with anger. The crowd watched in tense silence as Officer Barrett slowly moved to open the back door of his patrol car. Sarah sat calmly despite the discomfort of the tight handcuffs. The car's air conditioning was blasting cold air, making her shiver in her business suit. As the door opened, she maintained her dignified composure, just as she did in her courtroom. Judge Thompson, Sergeant Reynolds said respectfully, his voice filled with concern. "I am so sorry about this situation. Let me help you out of there." He reached in carefully to assist her. Officer Barrett's face drained of color as he watched his sergeant helping Sarah out of the car. "Wait, she really is." His voice trailed off as the reality of his mistake began to sink in. "Remove these handcuffs immediately," Sergeant Reynolds ordered Barrett. The younger officer fumbled with his keys, his hands now shaking as he realized the severity of his actions. As the handcuffs came off, Sarah slowly rubbed her wrists where the metal had left red marks on her skin. The crowd had grown even larger, and many people were still recording everything on their phones. Some were making calls, and Sarah could hear fragments of conversations mentioning the courthouse and the police chief. "Judge Thompson," Sergeant Reynolds said formally, "I want to personally apologize for this incident. I've already contacted Chief Williams at the courthouse and Police Chief Martinez. They're both on their way here right now." Sarah nodded professionally, maintaining her calm demeanor despite the situation. "Thank you, Sergeant Reynolds. I appreciate your quick response." She turned to look directly at Officer Barrett, who was now standing awkwardly to the side, looking like he wanted to disappear. More police cars arrived at the scene, their lights flashing. News vans were starting to pull up too, their reporters jumping out with cameras and microphones. The story of a judge being wrongfully arrested was spreading quickly through the city. Chief Martinez's black SUV screeched to a halt at the scene. The police chief, a tall woman with gray streaked hair, practically jumped out of her vehicle. Her face showed a mixture of horror and anger as she approached. "Judge Thompson," Chief Martinez said, her voice filled with genuine concern. "Are you all right? This is completely unacceptable." She turned to glare at Officer Barrett, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. "I would like to make a formal statement," Sarah said clearly, knowing that multiple cameras were recording. "I was stopped for allegedly running a stop sign, which I did not do. I properly identified myself multiple times, showed valid credentials, and requested a supervisor repeatedly. Instead of verifying my identity, Officer Barrett chose to escalate the situation unnecessarily." Chief Martinez nodded grimly, taking in every word. "Officer Barrett, surrender your badge and gun to Sergeant Reynolds immediately. You're suspended pending a full investigation." The crowd watched as Officer Barrett slowly removed his badge and gun, his hands trembling. Some people cheered, while others continued recording the scene on their phones. News reporters were pushing forward, trying to get closer for better shots. "Judge Thompson," a reporter called out, "how do you feel about what just happened?" Sarah straightened her jacket and looked directly at the cameras. "What happened to me today is unfortunately not unique. The only difference is that I happen to be in a position where my voice will be heard. This incident will lead to changes in our police department's training and procedures." Chief Judge Williams arrived from the courthouse, still wearing his black robe. He rushed to Sarah's side, his face showing both concern and anger. "Sarah, this is absolutely outrageous. The entire courthouse is in an uproar." As the scene continued to unfold, Sarah stood tall, her dignity intact. She knew that tomorrow, this story would be all over the news. But more importantly, she knew this incident would become a turning point for police reform in their city. What had started as a simple drive to lunch had turned into a moment that would change everything. Back at the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Barrett sat alone in the break room, his face pale and his career seemingly crumbling around him. The other officers walked past the room, some shaking their heads in disappointment, others whispering about how badly he had messed up. Meanwhile, in the chief's office, Police Chief Martinez was reviewing the body camera footage with Judge Sarah Thompson, Chief Judge Williams, and several high-ranking police officials. The large screen on the wall showed every moment of the incident in crystal clear detail. "Stop the video right there," Chief Martinez said, pointing at the screen. "Officer Barrett clearly ignored your credentials. This is beyond unacceptable." She made notes on her tablet, her hand shaking slightly with anger. Sarah sat straight in her chair, watching the footage with professional calmness. Even though seeing herself being handcuffed made her stomach turn, she maintained her composure. Her wrists still showed red marks from the too tight handcuffs. "The video has already gone viral," Lieutenant Garcia reported, holding up his phone. "It's all over social media. News stations across the country are picking up the story. Judge arrested while going to lunch is trending nationwide." Chief Judge Williams, still in his black robe, spoke up. This incident needs more than just disciplinary action. We need systemic changes in police training. His voice carried the weight of his 30 years on the bench. Outside the chief's office, reporters had gathered in the police station lobby. Their cameras were rolling, and their questions echoed through the building. Is Officer Barrett going to be fired? Will there be a lawsuit? What changes will be made to police training? Sarah's phone kept buzzing with messages of support. Fellow judges, lawyers, and even people she had sentenced in her court were reaching out. Many shared their own stories of similar encounters with police, though few had ended with such immediate justice. Judge Thompson, Chief Martinez said, turning off the video screen, "I want you to know that Officer Barrett's actions today do not represent our department's values. We are taking immediate action." Just then, there was a knock at the door. Sergeant Reynolds entered with a thick file in his hands. "Chief, I pulled Officer Barrett's record. There are 3 previous complaints about similar behavior, but none of the complainants well, none of them were judges." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Sarah thought about all the cases she had presided over, where people had claimed police misconduct but lacked the proof or position to be believed. "Those complaints need to be reopened," Sarah said firmly. "And we need to review all of Officer Barrett's arrests from the past year." Her judicial mind was already thinking about the legal implications. Chief Martinez nodded in agreement. "We'll conduct a full audit. But first, Judge Thompson, we need to address the press. They're not leaving without a statement." Sarah stood up, smoothing her suit jacket. "I'll speak to them," she said. "But I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about me or Officer Barrett. This is about creating real change in how our police interact with all citizens." Chief Judge Williams placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. "The entire judicial system stands behind you, Sarah. We can use this incident to push for the reforms we've been wanting to implement." As they prepared to face the press, Sarah could hear the commotion growing in the lobby. More reporters had arrived, and the story was getting bigger by the minute. She knew her words would be broadcast across the country. In another part of the station, Officer Barrett watched the gathering media crowd through a window. His arrogance from earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by the realization that his actions would become a national example of what not to do as a police officer. "Judge Thompson," Chief Martinez said as they walked toward the lobby, "how do you want to handle this?" Sarah paused, thinking carefully about her response. "With truth and purpose," she replied. "We're going to use this moment to create positive change. Every person who has ever been wrongly treated by police deserves to have their voice heard." The doors to the lobby opened, and camera flashes lit up the room. Microphones pointed forward, and reporters fell silent, waiting for Sarah to speak. This was more than just a press conference. It was the beginning of a movement for change, sparked by one officer's tragic mistake and one judge's determination to make things right. The next morning, Judge Sarah Thompson's story was on every news channel and newspaper front page. Her courthouse office was flooded with flowers, cards, and messages of support from people across the country. A headline in the local paper read, "Local Judge's Wrongful Arrest Sparks National Conversation." Sarah sat in her chambers, watching the morning news coverage on her laptop. Her face appeared on screen again and again, along with clips from yesterday's press conference. She had spoken calmly but firmly about the need for police reform and better training. "Your Honor." Her clerk Michael knocked and entered, carrying more cards and letters. "The public response is overwhelming. People from all over the city want to share their similar experiences." He placed the stack of mail on her desk carefully. Sarah picked up one of the letters and began reading. It was from a young black medical student who had faced a similar situation last month. "This keeps happening to people who don't have the power to fight back," she said quietly, placing the letter in a special folder. Chief Judge Williams called an emergency meeting of all judges in the main courtroom. The large room was packed with judges in their black robes, attorneys, and court staff. The atmosphere was serious as Sarah walked to the podium to address her colleagues. "Yesterday's incident opened our eyes to something we've heard about in our courtrooms for years," she began, her voice strong and clear. "But this time, it happened to one of us. We can't ignore it anymore." The room was silent as she shared her experience. Many judges nodded in agreement, some taking notes. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps remembering times they hadn't fully believed similar stories in their courtrooms. Meanwhile, at the police station, Chief Martinez was conducting her own meeting. Officer Barrett sat in front of a review board, watching his body camera footage play on the big screen. His face showed shame as his unprofessional behavior was displayed for everyone to see. "Officer Barrett," Chief Martinez said sternly, "your actions have not only damaged your own career, but have also hurt the reputation of our entire department. The internal affairs investigation shows a pattern of similar behavior in your past." Barrett stared at his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His union representative sat next to him, looking grim. The evidence against him was overwhelming. "We've received hundreds of new complaints since yesterday," Lieutenant Garcia reported. "People who were afraid to come forward before are now speaking up. They're calling it the Judge Thompson effect." Back at the courthouse, Sarah was reviewing new guidelines with a committee of judges and police officials. They sat around a large conference table, working on changes to police training and oversight. "We need immediate reforms," Sarah explained, pointing to the document in front of them. "Better training on identifying credentials, mandatory supervisor calls for disputed identities, and body camera reviews for every stop." Chief Martinez nodded in agreement. "We're already implementing changes. Starting today, all officers must call for supervisor verification when someone claims to be a public official. But we need to go further." The media interest hadn't died down. News vans were still parked outside both the courthouse and the police station. Reporters wanted to know what changes would be made and how quickly they would happen. Sarah's phone rang. It was the governor's office. They wanted her to lead a new state commission on police reform. The incident had grown far beyond one wrong arrest. It was becoming a catalyst for change across the entire state. "Judge Thompson," Chief Judge Williams said after the committee meeting, "you've started something important here. Your experience is going to help a lot of people." Sarah looked at the growing pile of letters on her desk. Each one told a similar story. People who had been mistreated but didn't have the power or platform to fight back. Now, their voices were finally being heard. As the day ended, Sarah stood at her chamber window, watching the sunset over the city. The red marks on her wrists had faded, but the memory remained strong. Tomorrow, she would return to her courtroom, but things would be different now. She picked up another letter from her desk and began to read. This one was from a police officer, thanking her for helping to create change that was long overdue. Sarah smiled, knowing that from this difficult experience, real progress was beginning to emerge. Outside her window, protesters had gathered with signs reading "Justice for All" and the Judge Thompson effect. What had started as one wrong arrest was growing into a movement that would change how police and citizens interact across the country. 1 week after the incident, Judge Sarah Thompson sat in a large auditorium at the Police Training Academy. Hundreds of police officers, both new recruits and veterans, filled the seats. Her story had become mandatory training material for every officer in the state. The lights dimmed, and the body camera footage from her arrest played on the big screen. Sarah watched the officers' reactions. Some shook their heads, others took notes, and many looked uncomfortable seeing how badly one of their own had behaved. "This incident," Sarah began as she stood at the podium, "changed my life in ways I never expected. But more importantly, it's changing our entire system." Her voice was strong and clear, carrying to every corner of the room. Chief Martinez stood nearby, nodding in agreement. The past week had been busy with new policies being implemented. Officer Barrett's case review had uncovered 27 similar incidents in his career, and each one was now being reinvestigated. "Yesterday, I received this letter," Sarah continued, holding up a piece of paper. "It's from a young man who was wrongly arrested last year. Nobody believed him then, but because of what happened to me, his case is being reopened." The auditorium was silent. Even the most experienced officers paid close attention. They knew this training session was different. They were learning from someone who had experienced police misconduct firsthand, and she happened to be a judge. In the back of the room, Sergeant Reynolds, who had helped Sarah during her arrest, shared his perspective. "When I arrived at the scene that day," he explained, "I saw an officer who had let his prejudices override his training. We can't let that happen again." Sarah clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from the past week. Over 500 people had come forward with similar stories of police misconduct. The numbers on the screen told a powerful story of a problem that had been hidden for too long. But this isn't about pointing fingers, Sarah said, looking across the room. This is about making real changes. Starting today, every officer will receive new training on implicit bias, proper identification procedures, and de-escalation techniques. Chief Martinez stepped forward to explain the new policies. Every traffic stop must now be reported in detail. Body cameras cannot be turned off during any interaction with the public. And most importantly, when someone identifies themselves as a public official, immediate supervisor verification is required. In the front row, a group of new recruits watched intently. They would be the first class to graduate under these new guidelines. Sarah could see hope in their young faces, hope for a better, more just system. The governor has approved funding for our new oversight committee, Sarah announced. The committee would include judges, police officers, and community members, all working together to review police practices and citizen complaints. After the presentation, officers lined up to speak with Sarah. Many shared their own stories of witnessing misconduct but feeling powerless to stop it. The culture of silence was finally breaking down. Judge Thompson, a young female officer, approached her. "Your story helped me report an incident I saw last month. I was afraid before, but not anymore." Sarah hugged the officer, understanding how much courage that must have taken. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Barrett's disciplinary hearing was taking place. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His previous complaints, combined with the video of Sarah's arrest, painted a clear picture of an officer who had abused his power repeatedly. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. More national news coverage was coming. Her story had sparked similar reforms in other states. Police departments across the country were using her experience as a wake-up call for change. Back in her chambers later that day, Sarah reviewed the latest statistics. Complaints against police were being taken more seriously. Officers were spending more time verifying identities during stops. The number of wrongful arrests had dropped significantly. "Your Honor," Michael entered with more letters. "These came in today. People are calling you their hero." Sarah smiled, picking up one of the letters. It was from a mother whose son had faced a similar situation. Now, because of the new policies, his record had been cleared. As the sun set outside her window, Sarah thought about how one terrible incident had led to so much positive change. Her wrists no longer showed the marks from the handcuffs, but the memory of that day would stay with her forever, not as a trauma, but as the beginning of real reform. The evening news played quietly on her office TV, showing clips from today's training session. The Judge Thompson effect, as people were calling it, was spreading across the country. What had started as one wrongful arrest was becoming a nationwide movement for police accountability and justice. 1 month after the incident, Judge Sarah Thompson stood at the podium in the state capitol building. The governor had just signed the Thompson Act into law, new legislation that would change police training and accountability across the entire state. The Grand Hall was packed with people. Reporters' cameras flashed as Sarah spoke about the journey from that dramatic day to this historic moment. In the audience, she could see many familiar faces: Chief Martinez, Chief Judge Williams, Sergeant Reynolds, and hundreds of supporters. "1 month ago, I was handcuffed in the back of a police car," Sarah began, her voice steady and strong. "Today, we're making sure that what happened to me leads to lasting change." The crowd broke into applause, many people standing to show their support. In the back of the room sat former Officer Barrett, now working as a police reform advocate. After losing his badge, he had chosen to help train officers about what not to do. His story had become a powerful teaching tool about the consequences of police misconduct. "The Thompson Act isn't just about protecting judges or public officials," Sarah continued. "It's about protecting every citizen. It's about making sure that every person who is stopped by police is treated with respect and dignity." Chief Martinez stepped up to explain the new law's key points: mandatory body cameras that couldn't be turned off, strict procedures for checking credentials, immediate supervisor response for complaints, and most importantly, a new civilian oversight board with real power to make changes. In just 1 month, Sarah shared, reading from her notes, "We've seen remarkable improvements. Wrongful arrests are down by 60%. Citizen complaints are being investigated properly. Officers are receiving better training. But we're not done yet." The governor handed Sarah the pen he had just used to sign the law. It would go in a display case at the courthouse, along with her handcuffs from that day, symbols of how justice could come from injustice. Later that afternoon, Sarah visited the new police training center named in her honor. The walls displayed photos and stories of people whose wrongful arrests have been overturned because of the new reforms. Each story represented a life changed for the better. Judge Thompson, a young cadet, approached her. "Your story changed how I think about being a police officer. I want to be part of the solution." Sarah smiled, seeing hope for the future in the young woman's eyes. Back in her courtroom, Sarah noticed changes in how officers testified. They were more careful, more respectful, more aware of their own biases. The Thompson effect had created a new culture of accountability. Her phone rang. It was the White House calling. They wanted her to help develop national police reform guidelines based on the Thompson Act. What had started as a local incident was now shaping policy across the country. "Your Honor," Michael entered her chambers with news. "The statistics for this month are amazing. Not a single wrongful arrest reported. The new verification system is working perfectly." Sarah nodded, feeling proud of what they had accomplished. At the police station, Chief Martinez was conducting a training session. On the wall hung a large poster showing the steps of the Thompson Protocol, the new standard procedures that every officer had to follow during stops and arrests. One wrong arrest changed everything, the chief told her officers. But it changed things for the better. "We're better officers now, better protectors of our community." The officers nodded in agreement, understanding the importance of their new responsibilities. Sarah's story was now being taught in law schools and police academies nationwide. Her experience had become a turning point in the relationship between law enforcement and the community they served. As she prepared to leave her chambers that evening, Sarah found one last letter on her desk. It was from a small-town police chief in another state, thanking her for inspiring them to change their own procedures before something similar happened there. Standing at her window, Sarah watched the sunset over the city she had helped transform. The sight of police cars on patrol no longer brought back bad memories. Instead, she saw them as symbols of positive change. "Ready to go home, Your Honor?" Michael asked, holding her coat. Sarah smiled, picking up the day's newspaper. The headline read, "Thompson Act Goes National. A New Era of Police Accountability Begins." She had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for justice, and that would be her lasting legacy. As she left the courthouse that evening, Sarah knew that somewhere in the city, a police officer was treating someone with new respect because of what had happened that day 1 month ago. And that, she thought, made everything worthwhile.